All right, welcome back to part two of this presentation. Part one had focused on kind of the project background and how the 30% design came about over various design iterations and considering different project inspirations, analyses that had been done, prior studies, and other visions for Grape Day Park. And now this component, part two, is going to focus on the 30% design and specifically about water quality and alternative compliance. And alternative compliance, as a refresher from part one, is a system of credits that developers can use to kind of mitigate for impacts that they have, that their projects have to stormwater. And so if you go in and you develop a site that has previously been, maybe it's open space or open land, and you go in and you develop that and you pave it over with a parking lot, you're going to be increasing the amount of runoff that comes from that site because now you're not allowing that water to percolate into the soil. And so you can either manage that on site by creating infiltration basins and stormwater treatment wetlands and other types of BMPs. But if there's not space on the site, you can also purchase credits to be able to mitigate for those impacts off-site within the watershed. And that's ultimately what alternative compliance is. And there are guidelines governing how projects can be used for alternative compliance. So this is going to talk about alternative compliance and kind of how we quantify or how we calculate what the water quality benefits are for this site and for this particular design. So this is going back and looking at the 30% design for the site, but this is a slightly different look at the graphic that we ended on in part one, where that was kind of more of a conceptual cartoon, and this is looking at kind of an engineering plan and kind of specifications for the site. So here we can see the channel alignment. Here we see these contours that show our grading plan. The channel has a series of these riffles or grade control structures where it's kind of a series of pools that kind of spill into each other. So water is moving from the upstream end here down over these little riffles and through the channel and then ultimately back into the tank where it's gravity flowing into the tank through a connection and being pumped from the tank back up into the channel. And so when water is actually entering the tank from these MS4 pipes, it has a few ways of being treated before that water is actually put into the surface channel. There are kind of pre-treatment facilities that screen out trash and other larger debris and sediments and things like that from even entering the tank. And then there are a system of baffles within the tank that cause water not just to dump into a vault, but to actually have flow paths within the tank that cause other materials like sediments to settle out within here, so that by the time you're pumping the water out of the tank and into your surface channel feature, this water has removed a lot of the kind of dirty things that we discussed being in that urban runoff, especially from the first pulse flow. And now you just have kind of dissolved constituents in the water, like nutrients and other things that are within the water column that you're trying to kind of percolate into the soil and treat as it moves into the groundwater table below. So this is just another view of kind of what that concept design looks like. And so ultimately, this presentation has more of the technical details as well, and more of the kind of engineering numbers behind it. And we'll try to explain what we mean in each of these areas, but it'll be a little more technical than part one of the presentation. So ultimately, what we're doing when we're determining the tank capacity is we're targeting this design control volume, or the amount of volume that needs to be within the tank to be able to effectively treat stormwater within the size of watershed that's coming in. And the Michael Baker study had determined that this was about 58,994 cubic feet, which is about 1.35 acre feet of storage when we look at the minimum invert elevation of the pipes, the MS4 pipes that are coming in to the tank. But we have two different sides coming in. There's an east connection and there's a west connection. So the east connection, which is kind of what we're calling this portion of the watershed over here, is about 2/3 of the contributing watershed that we determined visually from some of these graphics. The invert elevation is about 640.34 feet NAV 88, or the North American Vertical Datum of 1988. That gives us about 1.35 acre feet of storage beneath this invert elevation. But we also have another 1/3 of the watershed that's coming in from the western side that has an invert elevation that's several feet higher. And up until that point in the tank, we actually have more. We have about 3.5 acre feet of storage up to that invert elevation. And so, in that way, we can have a greater amount of storage than what the target design control volume of the tank is from the Michael Baker study. And we can kind of think about how this operates in a series of graphics here. And this is showing a very idealized version of the tank here. We're not drawing anything to scale. We're not showing baffles or the pump or other features within here. This is just very conceptual level of how the tank is operating. But we can see here that we have the east and west MS4 connections coming into the tank. We have the east connection at 640.34 feet, the invert of that pipe, and we have the west connection with an invert of 643 feet. And they have flap gates on them. So right now, when the water surface elevation in the tank is not up against those flap gates, they are open and allowing water to spill in from the MS4 into the tank. But as we fill the tank, we get up above the elevation of the east connection, which causes that flap gate to close, and any water that's moving down the MS4 pipes for about 2/3 of the watershed, once the tank gets this full, that water will just bypass the tank and enter Escondido Creek, as it currently does. So then we say that in this range we have a 66% bypass rate, or we're capturing about 34% of the water coming through, because we still have water that's able to enter the tank from the west connection here. This flap gate is still open. But as we raise the water even further in the tank, we can close off that flap gate, and now we don't have any capture. We have a 0% capture rate. 100% of the flow, of any additional flow moving through the MS4 system on either side of the tank, is going to bypass the tank entirely and just flow into Escondido Creek. So with these concepts, we can start to set up a water budget model that's actually trying to look at a daily time scale and simulate long periods of time, like a water year. So we're going from October 1st through September 30th of the following year. That's what we call a water year. So water year 1997 starts on October 1st, 1996, and ends on September 30th, 1997. It's a little shifted from what we think of as a calendar year, which goes from January through December. So what we do is we build a water budget model, which we use Microsoft Excel to create kind of a spreadsheet-based model that's doing what we call a water budget. And a water budget is kind of what you do with a bank account or any other type of budget, where you're trying to look at what you have coming in, what you have going out, and how that affects how much you have in savings. And ultimately what's going on here is that instead of money, we're talking about water. And there's a couple different storage areas that we can have this water, and there's a few places or a few ways that water can come in and leave the system. So if we're talking about the tank, we can get water from the MS4, which is the storm drain system. After rainfall, that storm drains will capture the street runoff and feed it into the tank. But we also have dry season flows that we had talked about in part 1, and those are another source of inflow to the tank that may be completely separate from any sort of recent rainfall. We can exchange water between the tank and the channel by pumping it from the tank into the channel and allowing it to flow back into the tank through gravity flow. We can have direct precipitation, rainfall falling directly on the channel or the surrounding areas that runs into the channel before it enters the tank. But we can also have a couple outflows from the channel. We can have water leaving through percolation, which means that it's seeping into the soil and ultimately kind of moving down into the groundwater table. Or we can have evapotranspiration, which means that we're evaporating the water from the open water surface of the creek itself, but also through the vegetation, like the grasses and the trees and things around the channel that are pulling up that water in their roots and evapotranspiring it through their leaves. So we don't have any losses from the tank. The tank, unlike the Michael Baker study, is not used for infiltration itself. The tank, the bottom of this is solid. It's concrete, it's impervious, and the only percolation and evapotranspiration that are occurring are within the channel element. And this is advantageous over having it happen from the tank because we have a relatively high groundwater table in this portion of Escondido, in this area of downtown. And so if you have the invert of the tank, the bottom of the tank is around the level of that groundwater table. So you won't really be able to likely percolate a lot of that water within the tank. But when we're pumping it up into the channel, now we're raising that through several more feet of soil, up to, quite a bit more soil in between the groundwater table and the bottom of the channel, and now you have a lot more space for percolation to be able to happen. So then what we do when we build this water budget model is we look at a range of water year conditions to try to understand how the system performs in dry years and then wet years and then normal years. And so what we have here is a water year exceedance curve, which is showing 12 water years arranged by annual precipitation, total accumulated annual precipitation for the period of 1981 through 2020 from a nearby rainfall gauge that's run by San Diego County. And we can see here that 1985 was one of our driest years. We have annual precipitation of less than 5 inches. We're probably, maybe 3 inches, 2.5 to 3 inches here for 1985, one of the driest years on record. 97.5% of all the years within that period are wetter than 1985. Whereas for 2005, only 5% of the years in this range were actually wetter than 2005. So this is one of our top wettest years here with over 25 inches of precipitation in 1 year. And then we look at water years 2001 and 1994 around the 50th percentile, which means these are median water years. These are kind of in the middle with respect to total accumulated precipitation by water year. So we looked at 12 within the basis of design report for the 30% design, but we're just going to focus on these 4 for the purpose of kind of understanding how this works. Ultimately, what we do is we use this water budget model to understand how much how much of the flow within the system within the MS4 we're able to capture and divert into the tank and prevent from reaching Escondido Creek. And by in order to do that, we have to understand how the level within the tank is varying over time. We need to understand what our inflows are, and we need to understand how quickly water is leaving from infiltration or evapotranspiration. So the image on the left shows an example of this water budget output. On the top pane, we can see the elevation or the stage of the water within the tank in this green line over time. So we're going from October 1st through September 30th, and this is for water year 1994. So we see tank stage over time, and it's kind of bumping up and getting to these different levels here. So we have dashed lines or dotted gray lines that are showing these elevations of the east and west pipes that are coming into the tank. So we see the areas similar to what we had looked at when we saw how the tank operates and closes different flap gates. When we're in a range within the tank where we have no bypass, 100% of the flow that's coming through is entering the tank, versus when we have 2/3 of the watershed, the 2/3 of the flow bypassing the tank. That's when the east connection closes. And when we get above 643 feet, we have 100% of the flow bypassing our tank, and we're not capturing anything. We can see that these inflows here are runoff events. These light blue lines are runoff. So precipitation happens that water hits the land surface and becomes runoff that enters the storm drain network and comes into the MS4 pipes that lead into the tank. And there are other flows like direct precipitation and dry weather flows, but on the scale that we have the graph, they're so tiny that you can't see them here, but they are above zero. They're just very small. But most of the flow coming into the tank is from this runoff, from precipitation events. And then we have areas where we have, when we have water within the tank that we're then circulating back out into the channel, we allow water to infiltrate and evapotranspire. So that's what the orange and gray lines look like in here, respectively. And we can also see that bypasses are occurring in red, and that's when we start to tick above these elevations where we, close some of the flap gates and some of the flow is actually just moving around the tank and back into Escondido Creek. So this is just kind of showing for a single water year over time how the stage is changing within the tank, what the inflows look like, and what the outflows look like. And we can also see that there's these kind of oscillations here where we slowly build up a little bit of stage, a little bit of water within the tank, and then it empties out, and then it keeps doing that. And that's a result of these dry season flows that are coming in. And once enough water is within the tank, the pump can turn on and move that water out into the channel, where it relatively quickly evaporates or percolates into the ground and kind of acts to empty out that tank. And as we talked about in part one, if we're just relying on stormwater and whatever's coming through the MS4, this is going to be dry for much of the summer. But then we can augment that potentially with reclaimed or recycled water to keep water moving in that surface feature all year round, so that it continues to act as a public amenity and not just within the wet season. So now that we've kind of looked at what these graphs mean in here, we can kind of take a step back and zoom out and think about what the results are telling us in terms of these different water year types. So we have water years 1994 and 2001 in this image. So these are our median water years around the 50th percentile for exceedance probability for average or for accumulated annual precipitation. And we can see that we're largely operating in this range in both years of having the tank be somewhat dry and up to the elevation of the east invert connection, where we're bypassing about 66% of the flow during some events, but largely operating between the bottom of the tank and 640.34 feet. When we look at some of the extreme years, however, we have water year 1985, which was one of our driest years on the left, and water year 2005, which was one of the wettest years on the right. We can see that for a very dry year, our tank is empty almost all the time, except we had two storm events that came through here. One of them was actually relatively large, and it caused, in one single rainfall event, even though it's a very dry water year when we think about the total amount of precipitation, it still had a large inflow event that caused the tank to fill up to over the elevation of the east invert connection here. And then we have a very small event late in the season. And so there are periods where, due to dry weather flows, we're also increasing the water surface elevation within the tank periodically and flushing it out into the channel, which is where we see an uptick in evapotranspiration and infiltration from here, even though the axes don't go high enough to show you where that's actually topping out. But for an extremely wet year like 2005, we have many different flood events, and for much of the time, from October through May, the tank and the surface feature have water within them that are being fed by the MS4, and often we are actually getting up to filling up the tank to 3.5 acre feet all the way up to 643 feet, at which point we're now bypassing 100% of the flow. And so we actually kind of combine these results across the 12 water years and look at statistics like the total amount of inflow, the amount that's being bypassed. The capture rate is the amount that was not bypassed divided by the total inflow. We can look at the amount infiltrated, the amount evapotranspired, how when the tank goes dry, how often it's wet and dry as a percentage of the water year. And we can look at statistics for the first flush. So the first flush we've defined here is the first runoff event each year that's greater than 0.1 inches per day of runoff from the watershed. And then we can look at similar metrics there like total inflow, bypass, and capture rate. And so there's a lot of variability in the capture rate because it really depends not necessarily on how wet the water year was overall with respect to total precipitation, but really depending on how big each event is. If you have a water year that has, you may have a lot of rain, but if they are all small events and you just have a lot of these small events, your tank is going to be able to absorb a lot of that water and prevent it from coming into Escondido Creek. Whereas if you have a dry year like 1985 that still has a relatively large rainfall event, you're going to not be able to capture all of that because you're quickly going to exceed the capacity of the tank to actually store that water. And so there's a large range of variability, but in general we're kind of going from about 70 to 92% capture rate on an annual basis for median and drier water years. And when we get into the wetter water years like 1983 and 2005, where we're in the top 25%, we're really getting down around 50% and even below 40% total capture rate for these extremely wet years. But overall, looking at this range of 70 to 92, sometimes even 100% capture rate in certain years. Infiltration is by far our largest outflow. Evapotranspiration is relatively small because it's a very, the channel surface area is very narrow. There's not a lot of surface area to allow for evaporation and not a lot of huge areas of plants to be able to pull on that water. There are plants along the edge of the channel, there's trees and things like that, but evapotranspiration is not really a large flux here compared to infiltration into the groundwater aquifer. When we look at the first flush flows, we see a similar range of variability. We're going from maybe 70 to 100% of the first flush flow being able to be captured by the tank here. And so this just serves to give kind of an overview that the basis of design report goes into more detail about how these results are interpreted, but it starts to give an idea of what the water quality benefit for the project is. If we have a 90% reduction, 90 to 92% reduction in some of these median years in total stream flow that's coming into Escondido Creek, then we can argue that we're having a 90 to 92% reduction in the pollutant load that would be coming into Escondido Creek as well. So just being able to understand how the project is operating under various hydrologic conditions, we can start to understand what the water quality benefit of the project actually is. And with that, completes part 2 of this 2-part series for this 30% design of the Escondido Creek Grape Day Park project. Thank you for listening.